Okay, we're on AC 1.2 again. This time I'm going to concentrate on charities and pressure groups. I've chosen two of these to focus on, the Howard League for Penal Reform and the Prison Reform Trust. Both are charities and at the same time both are pressure groups, so you can kill two birds with one stone. You need to have a reasonably detailed knowledge of the work of at least one of these, and you certainly need to know a number of the different campaigns that each of these has run. Please remember as we go through this that charities and pressure groups are not part of the criminal justice system, but you do need to know how they interact with the criminal justice system. Let's make a start. And as I've mentioned, they're not part of the criminal justice system, but they play an important role because what they're doing is they are holding the system to account. They're campaigning for the rights of prisoners, making sure that they're not lost in the system and the various different agencies are doing what they are supposed to do. So they serve a valuable purpose. Now, obviously, because they are charities, they're not funded by the taxpayer, but are funded by voluntary donations. So they're non-profit making organisations and they rely on charitable donations, bequests in wills, people giving money each month. But there are some benefits. All charities enjoy tax breaks, so there are some benefits for them in terms of funding, but no taxpayers' money is spent on the Howard League or the Prison Reform Trust. It's entirely voluntary donations. And as I've said, we're going to concentrate on these two key charities for penal reform. So it's the oldest prison reform charity. I'll concentrate here. The word penal, you may or may not have seen reform. If you think of the word penalty, if you commit a crime, you pay a penalty, and your penalty is going to prison. So hence the word penal. So if you think about the penal system, that's anything to do with people being in prison. So Howard League, named after John Howard, one of the first prison reformers. And according to its website, it works for less crime, safer communities, and fewer people in prison. And as you can see from this poster here, that is from the Howard League for Penal Reform, it would be fair to say it makes no secret of the fact that it thinks the current prison system is not tackling the underlying causes of crime. So I think it would also be true to say that the Howard League for Penal Reform, looking at the causes of crime and focusing on preventing those more so than specific work in prison. Not that it doesn't do work in prison, but it's the fact that its main thing is trying to stop people going to prison in the first place by focusing on the causes and stopping those from happening. Now, it justifies its views that prison isn't working on its website using the following argument, which is quite an interesting one to look at. So it makes the point that the number of people in prison has doubled over the last 3 decades. Now, this is quite a good statistic for you to have at the back of your mind, in your locker, in your armoury for the exam. When you are answering the questions that hold the most marks, they tend to be evaluation type questions where you are asked to weigh up both sides of an argument and come to a conclusion. Now, if you are trying to argue a point, having evidence, having statistics to back up that point makes it much more cogent, much more believable, much stronger. And therefore, if you want to get those very, very top marks in the big evaluation questions in the exam, you have got to have some statistics to back up the points you are making. So the fact that the prison population has more than doubled in the last 3 decades is a really good stat. Okay. Admittedly, they argue that most prisoners spend less than a year inside, but of course that comes at a terrible cost to us, the taxpayer, society, communities. You know, fathers and mothers are taken away from their children. Some children might be taken into care as a result. the money's not being earned anymore that they were earning. Whilst they're in prison, we, the taxpayers, are paying for them, and people in prison are not generating any wealth whatsoever. They are taking from society. Because the prison system, they argue, isn't working, we get high rates of people reoffending when they're released. So the same spiral, the same circle continues year in, year out. They go on to say that obviously as this prison population continues to grow, the money and resources available to pay for it are not going to be there. In my previous PowerPoint on the prison system, I think it was £118 a day to keep someone in prison. If you think about the fact that our population has doubled over the last 3 decades, if that trend continues, eventually we're going to run out of money to house all these people. Conditions are going to get worse, and the problem isn't going to be solved. And this then links to problems of prison suicide, rising violence, drug abuse behind bars, because as we see cuts in the prison system, prisoners aren't out as much, they're lying on their bunks with little positive to do, so they are resorting to other ways, illegal ways, of trying to make the time pass. And they carry on to make the point that crime is often caused by drug or drink problems or poor mental health, or through abuse and neglect at an early age. And they're saying the public deserves a justice system that tackles the underlying causes of crime and invests in prevention. So they would say, rather than throwing your money at the prison system, you throw your money at prevention, which then keeps people out of prison, which saves you money in the long run. So they're much more, as I said before, about dealing with the causes and investing in the causes of crime and preventing those in the first place. And their key argument is that, therefore, having looked at all this, you can never imprison your way to a safer society, because all you're doing is storing up and creating problems that come back to bite you later on. So they would refer to the high recidivism rates we have in this country. Recidivism is reoffending rates, the posh name for reoffending. So a recidivist is someone who habitually reoffends. Recidivism is the action of reoffending. So their campaigns. I focused on 3 campaigns. You just need to be aware of some of the things they've done. So we'll start with child arrests. The Howard League for Penal Reform ran a huge campaign to try and reduce the number of arrests of children in England and Wales. Think about children being arrested, being charged, they're not in school, they're not getting an education, if they resort to, they end up in a life of crime, they're not contributing to anything to society. And the Howard League for Penal Reform issued a huge campaign on this. They tried to raise awareness. One of the things they campaigned against was police having targets for arrests, because if you set a police force a certain amount of targets for arrest, then the emphasis on the police force actually meeting that target or they get in trouble. So they kept arresting children in an attempt to meet targets, it was argued. And they argued, or following the campaign, by 2016 they showed that actually the number of arrests had fallen over 6 years by 59%. So there are the stats for you. Okay, 245,000 roughly in 2010, 101 in 2015. And they claimed that that was because they were raising awareness, use of better resources, removing targets, improving staff training, supporting communities. So child arrest is a good one to use. Another good one to use is the books of prisoners. I found this quite extraordinary. In 2014, there were restrictions on sending books to people in prisons in England and Wales, and the Howard League campaigned to get this restriction removed. And in December 2014, a High Court judge ruled there was no good reason to restrict access to books for prisoners. It does seem bizarre to me that in 2020, as I do this in 2020, that only 6 years ago we were restricting prisoners from reading books. How bizarre. And perhaps the most interesting campaign, this is from a personal point of view, that I dug out, was their campaign to raise awareness of the lack of approved premises, APs. These used to be called bail hostels. Now you may remember when I if you've looked at the PowerPoint on the Crime Prosecution Service, that the probation service, that when prisoners are sometimes released on parole or released on licence, one of the conditions may be that they have to live in a certain hostel or a certain approved premises. Now, if you're a man in the prison system, there are 94 of these approved premises around the country. If you're a woman, there are only 6, which meant that if part of your bail condition was to live in an approved premises, what you had was women, because there were so few of these approved premises, living hundreds of miles away from their family and their children because there wasn't the facility nearer to home. And the Supreme Court, when the Howard League brought this campaign in, actually ruled that this was discrimination on the grounds of gender. You know, if you're a man, you would be more likely to be in an approved premises nearer to home than if you're a woman. And to give you some idea of this, I did a bit of research. If you're living in Plymouth and you're a woman, the nearest AP is Reading. That's 132 miles away. So imagine if you were living in Penzance in Cornwall, you'd be looking at over 200 miles. Plymouth to Reading will take you a good 2.5 to 3 hours drive. So if you're in Penzance, it's going to be another 4.5. It's ridiculous. Now, the Supreme Court ruled that it was discrimination, but whether the government will eventually build enough of these remains to be seen. And if you want to look at this in more detail, I have given you a hyperlink to the article. You'll have to go onto the other PowerPoint where I haven't got the commentary, but you can look at the stats and the article for the independent newspaper on that. Okay, hopefully that makes some sense of the Howard League for Penal Reform. Okay, I'm going to take you through a case study. This is called End Friday's Releases, or End Friday Releases campaign, and it was put together by NACRO, which is another pressure group, and the Howard League together. And if you look at the bottom here, you can find a link to the video about this. But basically, in a nutshell, the campaign was all about the fact that over 1/3 of all releases from prison happen on a Friday. And NACRO and the Howard League for Penal Reform have been trying to end this practice of releasing prisoners on a Friday, because if you are released on a Friday, you've got to race against the clock to access services such as accommodation, drug medication, benefits before they shut down for the weekend. And that, if prisoners who've just been released on Friday cannot access all those services on the Friday, then they're going to be in trouble, because the likelihood is they'll end up sleeping rough and having to survive on their discharge grant, which is currently £46, until those services reopen on Monday. And that then leaves so NACRO and the Howard League for Penal Reform would argue that leaves them very vulnerable to reoffending, and in some cases simply just to get a roof over their heads. They might steal or break into somewhere just to get shelter for the night. And obviously ex-prisoners quickly breach their licence as a result of this. So quite often these are prisoners that have been released on licence on parole, and of course if you reoffend in any way, you breach the terms of your licence and back to prison you go. So the End Friday Release campaign is a really good example of a case study that you can use to illustrate the work of the Howard League for Penal Reform and for other prison pressure groups such as NACRO. Moving on, we'll look at the Prison Reform Trust. So it was established in 1981, and it was effectively a splinter group of the Howard League for Penal Reform. It was formed by a group of campaigners who didn't like the direction that the Howard League were taking, because they felt they were concentrating too much on punishments in the community and were taking their eye off the ball in terms of working at improving conditions in prison. So they would say they work towards creating a just, humane and effective penal system. So they're much more concerned with actually conditions in prison. So its website states that it aims to, and I'm quoting directly, improve prison regimes and conditions, defend and promote prisoners' rights, address the needs of prisoners' families, and promote alternatives to custody. So again, they don't see prison necessarily as being the ideal punishment, but they're much more concerned in, prisoners' rights, the rights of prisoners' families, making sure that conditions in prison are improved. So, how does it try and bring about this change? Well, it does it in numbers of ways. It's constantly writing reports and inquiries into how the system works. It's digging away, looking at the systems in place and seeing if they can be improved in any way. It spends a lot of time raising awareness of prisoners, of their rights, of the staff, of their rights, and the wider public. They often campaign TV companies so that it's constantly prisoners' rights are in the news. So it's that constant, applying pressure, raising awareness. They try and influence Parliament, the government and officials towards reform. And so I think you could argue its main objectives are to reduce unnecessary imprisonment and promoting community solutions to crime. I think they would agree with that. To improve the treatment and conditions for prisoners and their families, and to promote equality and human rights in the justice system. Look at their working practices. It offers advice and information to thousands of people every year. That's prisoners, their families, prison and probation staff, legal professions, students, academics and interested members of the public. So it's constantly battering away, raising awareness, giving advice, letting people know what they can and can't do, trying to keep prisoners' rights at the forefront. It carries out masses of research, so looking at things that can be improved through studies and research. So I've put a list together of some of the research they've done recently. So they've looked at, done research on prisoners' views on prison education, for instance, the mental health needs of women prisoners. They've looked at how older prisoners are treated in the prison system. They've looked at the work of prison councils and how effective they are, of how foreign national prisoners are treated in our system, whether prisoners should have the right to vote or not. Currently, in this country, if you are a prisoner, you are not allowed to vote. And they also have done some research on how how people that are giving the sentences out make the decision to imprison. Why imprisonment and not a community service order, for instance. So that's what it does. Lots and lots of research. Had a number of campaigns. So two I've focused on. The first one's the Out of Trouble campaign, and that was a campaign that worked to reduce the number of children and young people who were imprisoned in the UK. Or you can have the Out for Good campaign, which was a project that looked at the opportunities for prisons to engage with employers. And they did a lot of study here, and they found that what was happening was the prison system wasn't getting prisoners ready for work on the outside, on their release. Or helping them to find work. And many people felt that actually this was because employers didn't want to employ people who come out of prison. And their report demonstrated that actually that wasn't the case. The potential to get secure, long-term employment for prisoners before and after release is huge, but wasn't being taken up. So that campaign, that Out for Good campaign, was trying to raise awareness that actually there are jobs out there for prisoners and ex-cons, and we need to make sure that we are training them correctly. So one of the things you could look at, if we're looking at prison education, if there is a shortage of plumbers, if there's a shortage of bricklayers, if there's a shortage of plasterers, then what the prison system needs to do when they are training prisoners up is train them in bricklaying, plastering and plumbing, because that is where the jobs are. It would be absolutely, let's say if there isn't a shortage of plasterers, it would be no point you training people up in how to plaster, because when they're released, the jobs aren't there in the outside. It's that simple. So those are your two campaigns of the Prison Reform Trust. Got to look at how they link with other agencies. It's slightly different for these two. I think really you could say that the the Howard League and the Prison Reform Trust will link closely with the Prison and Probation Service, because they're constantly campaigning for prisoners' rights. And then, of course, they'll also link to the courts, because they'll be trying to reduce the amount of custodial sentences being imposed. So there you are, 2 charities and at the same time pressure groups. I hope you found that informative. Goodbye.